Thank you for those of you who are tuning in. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's evening here in Jerusalem. Wherever you are, it may be early afternoon. As you've heard, there will be a series of 4 talks. They're all loosely connected to the theme of the history of the Jews in New York. And our method during this journey, this tour, if you will be to look at particular sites, landmark sites, places where we will be able to stop and talk for a few minutes about the meaning and the historical significance of the place or of the image, and explore through that particular place or site some of the themes connected to the history of the Jews in New York and beyond. Some of the sites may be more familiar to you than others. Even those of you who may know New York City, some of the sites are a bit out of the way, off the beaten path, as it were. And so some of it may surprise you. And one of the things that we will also do in the course of the 4 talks will be to look at how literature composed in New York City has reflected on some of the themes that we will be touching on. So without further ado, we'll begin today's talk. I call this first part Arrivals, and our purpose will be to look at a few of the essential places, sites, where we can talk about the arrival of people in New York City, even before it was New York, when it was in fact colonial New Amsterdam. And our first site or place where we will visit is in Battery Park. You will see from the photo a flagpole with a plaque. It was placed there in 1954. And as you see in the text, the plaque says that it was erected, the flagpole and the plaque were erected by the state of New York to honor the memory of the 23 men, women, and children who landed in September 1654, right there on that place, and founded the first Jewish community in North America. And it bears the title, the American Jewish Tercentennial, 1654 to 1954, the 300th anniversary. Major events celebrating the 1654 arrival of the very, very first Jews ever to set foot on the North American continent were held around the country. 300 years of what, one might ask? Those 23 people who landed in New Amsterdam, as it was at the time, the Dutch colony, were fleeing from the Inquisition in Brazil. They didn't apparently intend to get off the boat in New Amsterdam, but their funds ran out. Not only that, but of those 23, almost none of them actually remained in New Amsterdam. And in fact, of the initial Jewish community founded in North America, only one person actually lived through the Dutch period into the British period, and he was not among those 23. He was a Jewish immigrant originally from Lithuania. His name was Asher Levy. So these 23, what do we mean when we say they were the founders of the first Jewish community in North America? They were transients. Like many, many other people who landed on American shores then and since then, They came sometimes temporarily, sometimes for a few years, sometimes they moved on. Their trace did not necessarily continue. And America, as you probably are well aware, is a place of many, many beginnings. And so it was true of the Jews in New York as well. The 1654 date is obviously important as a memento, as a memorial. It was clear that it was a public relations opportunity for the American Jewish community to hold these 300-year anniversary celebrations to stress to the wider American public and to public institutions and state governments and the national government that Jews had extremely long historical roots back into the early colonial period. Today we know that this idea that in 1954 it was crucially important to bring to the fore these very, very early roots had something to do with the state of the nation at that time, the 1950s. It was just a bit after the Second World War, towards the end of the Korean War, and the period was the period of the McCarthy hearings. And to be patriotic, to be rooted in America, in the landscape, back all the way in time, as far as one could possibly go, seemed to be very wise public relations move. Not only that, but it fit in fairly nicely both in tone and in style with what other communities were doing at the same time. Just to give you an example, take a look at the photo that you see now. A similar flagpole with an appropriate base marked the Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam. In other words, not only the Jews were marking their early colonial origins, but other communities as well were taking the trouble to mark the early history of their language and culture and community on the shores of New Amsterdam, later New York. And so it fit in quite well, as I say, with what other communities were doing. The style, the idea of a flagpole to display the national flag, or in this case with the Dutch monument, the three flags, the national flag, the state flag, and the city flag. This was very much in keeping with the time, with the patriotic message. Nothing specifically Jewish or specifically Dutch could be said to adorn these places, and yet it was rather important for the communities to mark these sites. So the very first arrival is the 1654 arrival, and because it was the first arrival, it was an event that sparked interest not only in New York City, obviously, but around the country. Here, for example, is a similar monument with a flagpole, but with a somewhat more ambitious treatment with an architectural and sculpted format. This one was erected at that time in Forest Park, Illinois, commemorating the arrival of Jews in New Amsterdam in 1654. Why do it in Forest Park, Illinois? Well, the story of the first Jews to land on North American shores and to attempt to create some form of early community life was something that appeared to be a touchstone for the rest of the Jewish community around the United States. And so it was not just a local event that was being commemorated, but a national event that was being commemorated. And 1954, the opportunity for Jews around the country to gather around this particular historical moment and to own it, to make it their own, and to show off the early history, as it were, of their forebears, even though, as we know, by 1954, none of the people involved in these anniversary celebrations were in fact descendants of any of those 23 original people in New Amsterdam. Nevertheless, we're talking here in symbols. We're talking here in the use of history and the use of memory for public purposes. Now, New Amsterdam was an interesting place to land. As I said, not necessarily planned, but that's how it happened. 10 years after these 23 Jews arrived, New Amsterdam was conquered by the British. It became New York, and as we know it today. New York also, in those days, was an important settlement, but it was not necessarily the most important one, certainly not for Jews. There were many more Jews living in the Caribbean, in British colonies like Barbados and Jamaica. There were more Jews living in Charleston, South Carolina. Philadelphia had more Jews. New York was not that big a Jewish community at the time, but it was going to grow into the largest Jewish community in North America and later the United States. And it was going to grow into that larger community by stages. And one of the interesting facets of why this should have happened has to do with the economy. New York had, by the early 1820s, I'm going to move our little pointer here, up the Hudson River to Albany and cutting across westward through the newly constructed Erie Canal in the early 1820s, connected the harbor of New York to the trade with the frontier, with the interior, what was then the western frontier of the early American nation. Frontier goods and supplies would go back and forth along this trade route, and New York City by this time was overtaking other important American cities like Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, along the eastern seaboard to become what it remained for many, many years, the most important business and manufacturing and shipping center. And the fact that it was on its way to becoming such a big center and outshining, as it were, the other major cities along the East Coast, that is what was the magnet that drew, obviously, not only Jews, but everybody else who was arriving in the United States in those early years of the 19th century. And slowly New York City began to take on its role as the center for a larger Jewish population than other communities. And that, again, if we fast forward again to 1954, it's clear that New York City became symbolic, as it were, the Jewish Plymouth Rock, if you will, where Jews were able to look to New York City as a kind of a model of a large Jewish community which began to grow and began to thrive with constant immigration. Interestingly enough, it was at the time that the Erie Canal opened that there was one attempt, in sort of a virtual attempt, as we might say today, or a hypothetical attempt, to use the western frontier. And we're going to move our pointer once again back to the end of the Erie Canal, and we're going to think back to 1825 when it was proposed by a Jewish American journalist and playwright and political figure named Mordechai Manuel Noah, who proposed setting up a Jewish colony. And he wanted to call it Ararat, the mountain where Noah's Ark came to rest. His surname, after all, was Noah. And it was to be an asylum for the Jews of the world who might not be comfortable where they were living. And this was to become a kind of a Jewish state within New York State. Of course, it never actually happened. There was a wonderful grand opening ceremony with a cornerstone that was set. Noah proclaimed himself the plenipotentiary of this renewed Jewish state, as it were, but of course that was where the story ended. Nevertheless, it gives us an interesting counterpoint. New York City, on the one hand, begins to become this burgeoning metropolitan center, with more and more Jews beginning to arrive, particularly after the 1830s. And then at the other end of the Erie Canal, this idea, this sort of embryonic idea that Jews might find safe haven in larger numbers, and they would want to be in a colony of their own. And that's exactly the opposite of what happened. The colony of their own never actually took place. Jews instead settled along with hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of others in the big cities. So if we look a little bit further ahead, we're already in the years following the Civil War, the 1870s, migration and urban development, both commercial, manufacturing, the expansion of the city, the construction of the city of New York as it begins to resemble something that is familiar to us today. This is the city to which more and more Jews began to arrive. Again, we're with the theme of arrivals. It's in this period when immigrants arriving at the port of New York would disembark and be processed at this building that you see here with the pointer. Here it's a bit enlarged for you, called Castle Garden. Now this was in the era before the large immigration station was built on Ellis Island out in New York Harbor. Castle Garden here at the Battery, very, very close indeed to the site of the original 1654 landing and the 1954 flagpole. Castle Garden was this large structure where newly arriving immigrants, including Jews from all points of the European and Middle Eastern communities, would arrive and begin to take their first steps in the New World. The bulk of the Jews arriving in New York City between the 1830s and 40s and the 1870s, the bulk of them were coming from Central Europe or even East Central Europe. Many from the countries that eventually became Germany, Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, today the Czech Republic. Those were the areas, and Western Poland. Those are the areas from which Jews began to arrive in larger and increasing numbers. Eventually, by about 1880, taking the United States as a whole, we can talk about a Jewish population of about 250,000, and New York City housed almost a half of those. These sort of, we'll call them the Central Europeans. The evidence for their arrival, their growth, their development, one can see them in many cases in the synagogues that were built at that time. Here is a classic example of a synagogue building that is in fact still in use. The Central Synagogue, as it is known in its modern form, was a combined congregation of two earlier Central European Jewish congregations, Shar HaShamayim and Ahavat Chesed. As you can see in the slide, they were founded at the Shar HaShamayim at the end of the 1830s, Ahavat Chesed in the mid-1840s, and the congregations were composed mainly of Jews from Austro-Czech lands, the lands of the Habsburg crown. The synagogue, as you can see, is located at 123rd and 55th, at 55th and Lexington, 123 East 55th Street on the east side. It has the classic quasi-Semitic, Moorish look that was so popular for synagogue buildings in Europe and in the United States during those decades to emphasize the origins of the Jews in the Eastern Mediterranean. And as I say, this became a well-established, burgeoning community with a constant flow of newly arriving immigrants. But when the immigration flow really began to take off in larger numbers, and in fact to include many, many new arrivals coming from areas further to the east of the European continent, in Poland, Russia, Romania, that is the onset of what we refer to as the mass Jewish migration that lasted for about 45 years between the early 1880s and the mid-1920s. These images of the East European mass Jewish immigration are familiar to many of you from exhibits, photo albums, textbooks, and so forth. Scenes of tenement areas, slums, urban poverty, crowding, and so forth. The mass migration is called mass migration, as one might guess, because it involved not just a select few. It involved cumulatively, over the 45-year period of this mass migration, about 1 in every 3 Jews living in Eastern Europe at the time. 1 out of 3. That means more than 1 from each household. That means more than any similar immigrant group coming to the United States, with one important exception. The exception were the Irish. Half of the Irish left Ireland for the United States over the course from the time of the famine in the 1840s and the ensuing decades. Half of the Irish left for the United States. The Jews weren't quite in the same league with the Irish, but they were close. Just to give you an idea, in comparison with other groups, Italians, the number of Italians who arrived in the United States over the course of the mass migration period, their number was greater than any other single migrating group. But compared to how many Italians were there in Italy and how many of those Italians emigrated to the United States, the proportion is 1 out of 10. So 1 out of 10 Italians moved to the United States in the period of the mass European migration. 1 out of every 3 Jews from Eastern Europe, where the bulk of the Jewish population of the world lived at the time. 1 out of every 3 Jews moved to the United States. 1 out of every 2 Irish men and women moved to the United States. And now those are the sort of ballpark figures with which we're dealing. And obviously the arrival of such a massive number of people created huge challenges, not only for them personally, individually, for their families, their children, to reestablish themselves under less than ideal conditions. But clearly these were challenges for the city, for the country, and for the American public, trying to come to terms with the fact that these millions of people were entering the country, and was it a good idea, or was it not a good idea? Just again to give you a bit of the flavor of the time, what you see in this slide are the transportation available to immigrants coming from Eastern Europe at that time as they set out on their journey. On the left, a photo from inside a railway carriage. The trains had developed tremendously in Europe by this time, which made it feasible and fairly cheap to travel from places in Poland and Russia to the ports in Germany or in Belgium, crowding into these trains on their way to Hamburg or to Bremen or to Antwerp. Sometimes, as you see in the photo on the right, people actually set off on foot. This particular group were in Romania, about to set out on their way to make their way slowly overland and on foot to cross the border into Austria-Hungary, and from there to points north and west. Collectively, they were referred to as Fußgänger, the people who went on foot. They went in these large bands of young men, mostly young men at the time, and they would go from town to town with banners, and this became, because it was a mass migration involving so great a proportion of the Jewish population, this became more than the individual story of a particular family or a cluster of families. This became an event of national proportions. Now, as I said, the arrival over a fairly concentrated period of time of so many people was going to entail huge challenges at the social level in terms of social welfare, in terms of how were these people to be accommodated, where were they to live, how were they to make their first way, their first steps into their new homes, into their new society. Some of them arriving in the early years of the 1880s, and here I'll speak specifically of the Jewish case. The arrival of some of the very early Jews who coming out of the Russian Empire in the 1881, 1882 year and a half, 2 years following the outbreak of pogroms in southern Ukraine. Some of them were arriving destitute. They didn't have the means to settle themselves. The government was not involved. There was no immigration authority. What was to be done? I'm going to give you here the next site or physical, geographical point on the map that I'd like us to bear in mind. Remember, we started with the battery, the arrival point in 1654, the point at which Castle Garden was later built as the intake station for arriving immigrants. We're now going to move to the East River between Manhattan and Queens, actually between Manhattan, Bronx, and Queens, to Ward's Island. Ward's Island today, combined with Randall's Island, one can still visit. There's a big prison on Randall's Island, among other things. Ward's Island was already designated in the 1840s and 1850s as a kind of a welfare station. It was there that in 1847 the state built the largest hospital complex in the world at the time. It was a hospital and refuge for sick and destitute immigrants. Later on, it was converted into an asylum for the insane. It was on Ward's Island, this place that had been set aside to deal with some of the weakest members of society, in particular newcomers, that the Jewish philanthropist and financier Jacob Schiff decided that he had to do something to help these Jewish refugees, as they saw them at the time, arriving in the panic of 1881, 1882, coming out of Russia with very few prospects and very few skills. He set up a temporary shelter there. Apparently part of the existing complex of buildings was set aside for this purpose, for these Jewish immigrants to be given food and shelter initially. What happened, though, is that Apparently, he wasn't a micromanager in this particular project. He was a micromanager in many other projects that he continued to set up over his lifetime. He, as one of the key philanthropists in the Jewish world, in the United States in particular, he had a hand in practically every philanthropic institution and venture that was set up for the Jewish people during his lifetime. But in this particular instance, his eyes were somewhere else. And the conditions at the Jewish immigrant shelter in Ward's Island were not, shall we say, they didn't pass muster. The food was terrible. The hygienic conditions were not something to write home about. And we're talking about people who came out of small villages and towns in Eastern Europe. It wasn't like they were expecting the Hilton. But there was a food riot. The Jews in the Ward's Island immigrant shelter staged a food riot in the fall of 1882 in protest against the abysmal conditions under which they were being supposedly helped, and they demanded some improvement. Well, this did light it rang some alarm bells, and a hastily put together committee that actually started off in 1881, early 1882, known as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. Note, it was an emigrant with an E, Aid Society, not to be confused with the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, known by its acronym HIAS, which still exists today. It was a later organization, which, by the way, Jacob Schiff also helped to establish. But the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society was a forerunner. It was an initial effort by wealthy and well-placed Jewish community leaders to do something about this sudden massive influx of unexpected immigrants coming out of Russia. So a group of people from HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, including one young poet by the name of Emma Lazarus. They got in a boat and went over to Ward's Island to investigate, what was the cause of this food riot and why were these Jewish immigrants who were being helped, why were they so ungrateful and why were they making so many problems. And they realized that the conditions really were not as they ought to be, and they recommended various changes. Interestingly enough, Emma Lazarus went home that day after her visit to Ward's Island, although she did visit several times afterwards. She went home that day and she began thinking that actually it didn't make a whole lot of sense for the United States to be the place where all these potentially millions of Jews from Eastern Europe, coming from what she considered, and many other Americans like her, considered to be a backward part of the world, people without the means, the skills, the education to make their way successfully in American society as it existed in the early 1880s. She basically wrote a report saying, well, first of all, this immigrant shelter in Ward's Island has to be run completely differently. The people there have to take charge of their own lives. They have to start doing laundry. They have to start learning English. In other words, let's do something scientific rather than simply handing out money through the soup kitchen. But moreover, and this is the point that I'm getting at, she said, the United States only up to a certain point is going to be willing to accept all of these millions of people. And what's going to happen then when there will be too many to handle? And she began subsequently writing a series of articles that she published in the newspaper called The American Hebrew. It was called An Epistle to the Hebrews. And in it she laid out her idea that rather than extending a welcome to all of these millions of destitute Jews fleeing from Russia who would never make it in America, maybe it would be a wiser policy for the Jews of the Western world, including the United States, to get themselves together, to collect funds, to be able to pay for the restoration of the Jews to Palestine. Emma Lazarus, whom most of you know, through another context. This was Emma Lazarus in 1882 saying the United States might not be the best place for all these millions of Jews to come. Their culture is so different. They are going to have to give up so much of their culture if they come here. It's never going to work. Let's pay for them to go somewhere else. And the irony, of course, as you have guessed by now, is that a few months later, in 1883, the early 1883, the same Emma Lazarus was going to write one of the most important poems in the history of American literature, familiar to nearly all of you, I'm sure, as the sonnet that is inscribed at the base of the Statue of Liberty, in which she contributed this sonnet to a public relations campaign to raise funds for the building of the pedestal for the statue. Famously, it was a gift from the French nation to the American nation in 1876 on the occasion of the first centennial of American independence. It was the statue by Bartholdi was a gift to celebrate the common political values of the two republics, the French Republic and the American Republic, and one needed to raise the funds to create the pedestal that would hold the statue. Look at what Lazarus wrote in 1883, several short months after the Ward Island episode, and completely in a different vein, completely in a different tone. And one wonders what she was thinking. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates in the far west of the world shall stand a mighty woman with a torch whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. This is no longer a gift of the French Republic, liberty, and the torch representing the political values of two republics. Rather, the Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome, and so forth, and the famous passage that many of you probably know by heart from when you learned it in school, the same way I did. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore, speaking to Europe, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. And here we have the words that, nobody paid attention at the time, by the way. It wasn't until 20 years later that Lazarus, who had died in the interim, one of her close friends, brought the sonnet to the public attention and had it inscribed in the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty, and the whole legend of Emma Lazarus and the statue begins then. And it's the transformation of the meaning of the statue in the American public sphere from a celebration of American independence from a friendly republic in Europe. It was transformed into the Mother of Exiles, the statue that, in Emma Lazarus's words, gave welcome to the huddled masses, to the immigrants arriving. And this is a far cry from what she had written about her own Jewish brethren who were the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And she basically said, well, maybe they ought to go somewhere else. And this irony, this conflict, as it were, this ambivalence is something that we have to deal with when we think about Emma Lazarus and who she was. She was a complex person. She had many, many ideas. She's justly famous because of this magnificent sonnet. But it should be said that in terms of New York City and the Jews and the arrival of the Jews, with all due respect to the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, their idea that, better that the Jews should go somewhere else, it didn't actually gain much traction. The Jews actually kept coming in greater and greater numbers. Emma Lazarus, however, was right in one sense. She was right that eventually the United States, from a political point of view, would put a limit to immigration. As we all know, by 1921, the American government instituted a quota system based on national origins. The era of mass European migration ground to a halt. By 1925, the quotas were reduced even further. And 4 years later, with the crash of the stock market and the onset of the Great Depression, in 1929, the administration in Washington proceeded to make the process of new immigration even stricter and so on. The difference, you can, in terms of numbers, we're talking about pre-1921, there were about 120,000 Jews arriving every year from Eastern Europe, mostly Eastern Europe, other places as well, but mostly Eastern Europe. 120,000 a year before 1921, and after 1921, it plummeted to only 10,000 because the quotas for Eastern Europe were rather low. So there's irony involved here, and yet the Jews kept arriving until the United States immigration policy changed. I'm going to end off our talk about arrivals with one other arrival, and this one is a literary arrival, but it contains a very, very dark take on the same statue and on the same scene of arrival. It's a passage that I've taken from the prologue to the novel Call It Sleep by Henry Roth. It was a novel first published in 1934. Concerns a family of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, a father, a mother, a young boy named David. Those of you who have read the novel, I'm sure, understand how powerful it is. I'm going to just read with you this passage from the prologue. And before them, rising on her high pedestal, from the scaling swarmy brilliance of sunlit water to the west, liberty. The spinning disk of the late afternoon sun slanted behind her, and to those on board the boat carrying the immigrants across the water, her features were charred with shadow, her depths exhausted, her masses ironed to one single plane. Against the luminous sky, the rays of her halo were spikes of darkness roweling the air. Shadow flattened the torch she bore to a black cross against flawless light, the blackened hilt of a broken sword. It's a very different image than the torch with the imprisoned lightning of liberty. And now the prologue to the novel continues, speaking about the mother who has just arrived with a little boy to meet her husband who has been in New York previously. He has been waiting for them. She lifted the sobbing child to her breast. With a vacant, stunned expression, her gaze wandered from the grim, smoldering face of her husband to the stern of the ship. Before her, the grimy cupolas and towering square walls of the city loomed up. Albert, she said timidly. Albert, Gehen wir wohnen du in New York? Up until now, of course, the novel has been written in English. And suddenly, with the intrusion of the Yiddish, we begin to understand that this entire novel represents a family that who's living and speaking entirely in Yiddish. That's something that we can perhaps discuss at some later point. It's not that crucial right now. Let's continue. Gehen wir wohnen du in New York, which means, are we going to be living here in New York? Nein, Bronzeville. Hat schon geschrieben. No, not here in Manhattan, not here in New York, but in Bronzeville, that is Brownsville in Brooklyn. I wrote you about that already. Screw threshing, backing water, the Peter Stuyvesant, this small craft carrying this family across the water to Brooklyn. The Peter Stuyvesant neared her dock, drifting slowly with cancelled momentum, as if reluctant. And think of these images, the blackened hilt of the broken sword, the stunned expression on the face of the woman, this difficult scene with the husband, the reluctance, as it were, even of the boat to actually arrive and to dock in this dingy port of Brooklyn. And the, hang on, we'll just go back for a moment. This reluctance, this growing sense of alarm, even of doom, is something that is going to inform the rest of the novel. I won't spoil it for you if you haven't read it yet. Highly recommended if you wish. But it's a very, very different view. It's a very, very different use of the image of the Statue of Liberty as the symbol of arrival. And here we have another arrival, and it's an arrival that is going to bypass the great legend and myth of Miss Liberty and go over to Brownsville, and that is where we will start off our session next week with Brownsville, Brooklyn, as well as back in Manhattan in the Lower East Side to explore the urban landscape. And I thank you for your attention, for listening. And now we have some time for questions, Tamar, if we've got any from the people at home.
Yeah, we've got a few questions. Let's see.
Okay.
First of all, first question: how were the early Jewish immigrants received in America?
Depends how early we mean. If you're talking about the earliest ones that I spoke about in 1654, they were not received very well at all. The Dutch governor of the colony, Peter Stuyvesant, interestingly, the name of the boat that Henry Roth used in the novel that I just quoted from, it's no accident that he called that boat the Peter Stuyvesant. Peter Stuyvesant was the governor of the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. He was a strict Calvinist, did not want any Catholics, certainly did not want any Jews, and pretty much wanted to get rid of the Jews who had arrived without warning, without means, apparently. Stuyvesant had one problem, however. He was governor by virtue of his appointment by the stock company that ran the colony, the Dutch West India Company. And among the stockholders and among the members of the board of directors of the Dutch company, there were a number of well-heeled Jewish merchants in Amsterdam. And when Stuyvesant wrote to his parent company in Amsterdam, look, I've got this bunch of refugees on my hand, I'd like to kick them out, what should I do? The company, after several discussions with some of their influential members, wrote back to him and said, no, you have to let them stay. You don't have to allow them to have the right to public worship. You know, we got a problem with non-Calvinist churches, but they can stay, and thereby, but they have to take care of their own material needs. They have to take care of their own poor people. And it was this idea that Jews were allowed into New Amsterdam on sufferance, as it were, that animated some of the later ideas that Jews had, that in order to merit, in order to deserve a welcome in the new country, one had to be willing to take care of one's own.
Okay. Weren't the more veteran German Jews against the Jews from Eastern Europe? Or maybe we'll get to that in later stages of the series?
Well, part of what I spoke about earlier with Emma Lazarus, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, their reaction to the scene on Ward's Island, and that was only microcosmic because, in fact, again, more and more Jews kept coming. And they weren't all going towards Island. They were settling in lower Manhattan and in Bronzeville. This idea that more and more and more of these Jews coming out of Russia in particular, but Eastern Europe generally, the fact that they might be undesirable in the eyes of other Americans was a problem. And it was a problem that some of the sort of more established Jewish community in New York and in America at large were worried about. And interestingly, they went about this worry in several different ways. Emma Lazarus, as we saw, came up with this brilliant scheme. Well, let's ship those Jews somewhere else. Tell them not to come here. Tell them to go to Palestine. They'll be much better off. But others had another idea, said, let's send them back to Russia. And still others had a third idea, like Jacob Schiff, said, well, you know, we're going to have to do more to make sure that their initial steps in the New World will be more successful. And he goes on and on with creating hospitals, temporary housing for new immigrants, and more help for immigrants as they began to grow into a larger stream. So there are different reactions, different responses. There was a certain class animosity between the more affluent, well-established, bourgeois, German origin Jews who were already there for sometimes a generation or two or even three. Like Emma Lazarus was already fourth generation in the United States with mixed German and Sephardic Jewish ancestry. So some of them, you know, they looked a bit sort of a little bit down on these unwashed masses, but it must be said that they actually helped a great deal in the end. They went so far as to send, going a bit further in time now, by the time Ellis Island gets opened up, and it's a major installation, people who were arriving at Ellis Island before being admitted to the United States were processed by the Immigration Bureau. And some people were not allowed to enter. They were going to be deported, and they were given a hearing. And what happened was these same German, so-called German Jews, they were American Jews whose parents or grandparents had come out of the Central European part of the continent, that much of which was German-speaking at the time. These same German Jewish community agencies sent representatives to Ellis Island to defend these candidates for deportation, Jews who were too poor or too unskilled or seemed perhaps to be suffering from an illness or some reason for them that they might be subject to deportation, along with many others who were being deported at the time. And these Jewish organizations, whom we tend to think stereotypically, well, they were anti, these East European Jews, they actually went to bat for those East European Jews, and they made sure that the number of Jews who were deported after having made it across the ocean was very small. In fact, almost none. In statistical terms. So you've got to take the good with the bad. There were some hard feelings involved, but there was also a sincere effort to help. And you know, for those who like to romanticize this, again, there were some people who continued to invoke the image of Peter Stuyvesant. We Jews made a promise to Peter Stuyvesant, and now we have to keep it to take care of our own.
And how did the Irish immigrants react to the Jewish immigrants?
Here again, there are many answers to a question like that. Look, in general, large immigrant communities created urban enclaves. We'll talk a bit about this next week. In the same neighborhood or in adjacent neighborhoods, there would be Irish people concentrated in an area, Jewish people in an adjacent area, Italian people in another adjacent area, African Americans coming up from the south, again, making a kind of an urban geography of concentrated neighborhoods. And these neighborhoods became home turf to entire ethnic communities, and there was street tension between especially kids. Young boys would use the streets as if it were their turf and defend their turf against the invasion of others. And so some of this spills over into incidents in the street between Irish gangs and Jewish gangs. But if we, sort of zoom out a little bit and look at, where were the Irish and where were the Jews, as it turns out, first of all, most of the Irish began coming earlier. Most of the Jews came relatively later. That meant that the Jews and the Irish didn't really find themselves in direct competition for the same jobs. And that meant that even though, there was maybe no love lost between Catholics in general and Jews in general, or Irish in particular, and nevertheless, they lived in the same urban landscape more or less as neighbors. And as I say, the kind of direct competition that might have incited perhaps greater tension, it was actually minimal.
Okay, I think we'll take one last question, which was actually repeated a few times, and I'm apologizing because we can't take time to answer all the questions. So a few people wanted to know what actually happened to the original 23 Jews who arrived there. Where were they planning to go, and where did they end up?
Well, we don't know for sure. Most of them apparently were on their way back to England or to Holland. They were Dutch Sephardi Jews who had emigrated to Brazil when parts of Brazil were held by the Dutch, Suriname, Brazil, and when these Dutch colonies were overrun by the Portuguese, who in particular in Brazil, these Jews had to leave. And many of them apparently were going to go to England or to Holland. But then they got off the boat in New Amsterdam. Some of them stayed for a while. Some of them ended up re-emigrating to the Caribbean, which in fact they had come from physically. They didn't actually sail from Brazil to New Amsterdam. They had already been in the Caribbean in several of the Dutch and English colonies. Some of them went back to the Caribbean. Some of them ended up going really back to England and to Holland. Think, for example, of what happened to the Torah scroll. That they were sent a Torah scroll from Amsterdam to help them to organize themselves as a community. And because this small community of the initial 23, plus a few other individuals who came in independently, because they dispersed and only one guy was left by the time the British arrived, the Torah scroll was returned to Europe, and there was no use for it. There was no congregation. So that is why, if we think about the origins of the Jewish community in New York, we have to think of it as a sequence of events, that maybe the earliest one was indeed in 1654, but in fact, we're talking about a process of many decades during the course of which new immigrant individuals and families were going to arrive without any connection whatsoever to that original group of the 23.
Thank you. And for those whose questions weren't answered, join us for the next sessions in the series. And I hope you'll have opportunities to ask again, or maybe things will just be answered as we move forward in the history of the Jews of New York. Thank you very much, Professor Lederhendler, for taking us on this journey. And maybe some of us would like to be in New York at the moment, but I guess we'll have to enjoy this tour for now. Thank you for joining us, everyone, whether you're from here in Jerusalem or anywhere else around the world. And we hope you join us next week. Good day, good evening, depending where you are.